Hello everyone, I hope you've all been doing well and welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be sharing with you the process for this month's July's coffee print. In a way, this speed paint will contain a more in-depth explanation of a lot of the methods that I used previously in my Dragon Prince Truya speed paint video. I'll provide a link above or below for those that would like to watch it later. This does mean, however, that this video will be a bit longer than my usual speed paints, so be sure to grab some snacks, get a drink of some sorts, get yourself comfortable, and we'll begin shortly. So starting off, one of my biggest dilemmas when working on this print was I didn't quite know exactly what I wanted to do. There were so many ideas I had running in my head, but none of them quite felt right to be used within the given circumstances that I had. I really wanted to focus on something like narrative heavy, a bit more of a storyline, while trying to fit all of that on just like one scene. And for a moment, I almost considered making this a 3-panel narrative drawing, something that I adore making whenever I get the chance. I feel like using 3 panels is the perfect length for someone who kind of just wants to jump in and write like a quick story without having it become too long and become too overwhelming in the long run. I find that using 3 panels works for me perfectly, since with the first panel I can just have like the scene set up the characters and everything. The second panel I can have a bit more of the exposition of what's going on, and then the third panel I can kind of finally have like some sort of like a simple resolution or like the main focal point. Now mind you, this 3-panel narrative is mostly for the purpose of just having the core idea of the main storyline be locked down. Depending on the story or the message that you want to express, you can of course freely adjust the number of panels that you want to do. If you feel that the story that you have in mind will take a bit more time, definitely add more panels or, more pages. If you feel that you can condense all that you want to say into one scene, that is fantastic and amazing, and I applaud you for doing that. Ultimately, do what works best for you. For anyone interested, I can always talk more in depth about this in future videos. Just let me know down below in the comments what you'd like to see. You can also view more examples of my 3-panel narratives on my Twitter and my Instagram account at moonfishghost. But the original reason that I wanted to try out the 3-panel narratives was that I had the idea of maybe Dazai and Truya. They were both riding on top of a dragon. They're soaring like above the clouds and like looking down into some sort of landscape, a valley of sorts below, with the baby dragon just like desperately trying to keep up with everyone else, only to probably eventually just like land and rest on the parent dragon for the rest of the ride. And even though I was really enthusiastic about this idea, it still didn't feel quite right to be used for July's coffee print. I've decided instead to save this idea for a later date when I am ready to work on another 3-panel narrative drawing. At this point, I decided to mostly just jump in and start doodling, just scribbling out anything that comes to mind. Sometimes when you're stuck trying to visualize the idea fully in your mind, it can only bring you so far. The act of actually drawing will help the brain start like churning out ideas in a different way. And I personally find that this method is usually what guides me towards locking down on the final idea. So as I was scribbling this, I kind of realized that I wanted to make this almost resembling that of a tapestry that you'd see in a medieval castle of some sort, or at the very least, it gives off those vibes. I found a lot of inspiration in designing the background through The Last Unicorn. For those that aren't familiar with it, The Last Unicorn is an animated film that was released back in the early 1980s. As the title says, it's about a unicorn finding out that she's the last of her kind, which is very unusual since unicorns are immortal. So, wanting to find out what happened to them, she leaves her home in hopes that she'll discover their whereabouts or whether she's actually the last one left. I personally highly recommend that you check it out at least once in your life if you haven't watched it yet. Both the visuals and the music are stunning. And let's be honest, this song is in my primary Spotify playlist. It is my go-to song for when I am in the mood for one of my like late night drawing sessions. There's just something really calming and what's the word? Ethereal. As you listen to the song and you're alone by yourself with nothing but the light of the lamps or the light of the monitor on as you draw the night away. I find that finding the right kind of music that you're in the mood for in that moment really helps ease the transition into focusing on the project that's in front of me. But now I want to know, what is your go-to song that will help get you into focusing on like your work and whatever you do that you need to get done in that moment? What's the genres that you like to listen to? Or if music isn't your thing, what's the type of shows that you want to watch? What are the ones that you know that without fail will help you focus? Or if neither of those, are you someone who prefers that there be no audio, no forms of distraction as you're working? Or is there another method entirely that I am not aware of? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. So at this point, we have finalized the draft and are now beginning the very long process of inking everything and adding the line art. I am very tempted to say that inking took about 2/3 to 3/4 of the entirety of the time it took me to finish this. But also, that's because there's so many different elements present in the drawing. There's inking for both of the dragons, for all of the embroidery on both of Desai's and Tria's outfits, bits of embroidery even on like the tapestries. The scales definitely took a long time. They were very therapeutic, but they definitely took a bit longer than I planned for. And then also the entirety of the window at the back with the scenery inside of it, contained within it. Contained sounds right, but I know that does not make sense at all, realistically. A lot more time was devoted towards finessing and timing the sketch in the early stages than I normally would do. This helps me smooth out the process of inking, especially when there's so many different parts to the piece. It definitely helps save me from having to guess which rough line to follow as I ink, and I am certain at this point that everything looks correct proportionately. It definitely makes the process more seamless. Now, the only parts that I've left vague is mostly line work for stuff like the textures, such as the sequins and the scales. I can draw those without needing to use a cleaner rough since I'm using the items that they are on as guidelines already. For example, I follow the path of Tria's cloak and how it drapes to help me figure out a good pattern that will flow alongside it. Similar to that, I use the placement of the dragon's eye and horns to kind of mold the scales alongside them. It's almost like you kind of have the scales just growing out and away from the eyes and the horns. Definitely this one's a lot more line art heavy than what I usually do with my rendered drawings. It's honestly very fascinating to see where the focus of planning and concentration differs between these two methods. To be fair, I can only speak on behalf of these two since they are what I am personally most familiar with. And even then, I know everyone has a different approach towards rendering and line art. So just consider this as my way of recording my personal art journey thoughts and reflecting on them for a bit. For line art, I see that it helps me more if I get all of the ideas refined and sketched very early on in the art process, like you see me just now. It helps add the structure for something so precise as line art, and saves me from a lot of pain further down the line. As you can see, I decided to add Tria's other arm and make it more visible last minute, but because of how it's set up, I was able to just add it in very cleanly without fear of having to like fix everything else or needing to shift anything around, which is very much a big time saver. Whereas for painting or rendering, I tend to get looser with my roughs. My focus more at that point is to just scribble everything out to better grasp the energy of the drawing. Then I'll finally refine everything together as I am rendering, which is usually the longest part of the process. Thinking about it now, I kind of realized that for rendering, I start kind of backwards from the steps that you kind of traditionally know for the line art. For example, usually after I have like finessed everything with rendering and such, put a teeny tiny amount of line art to just finalize it all together. I think it's really cool that even though those are two different methods you're using, you're kind of applying a little bit of both for whichever method you choose. It's just a matter of which aspects you'd like to prioritize more or emphasize more, if that makes sense. And because of that flexibility, we're able to approach art in so many different ways, using methods found from all sorts of backgrounds: line art, rendering, lineless art, contour art, non-objective art, and so much more. All of these can be combined all together to develop separate styles to everyone's personal tastes. It's personally so fascinating and an area of topic that I really enjoy looking into. But before I get more carried away, let's redirect back to what's going on right now in the drawing. I am currently lining the mane of the dragon. As you can see, I put a little bit of a guideline that kind of represents like the spine so that I can see how the dragon is twisting around in the drawing. Since it's the mane, I wanted to add a bit more hatching, a bit more lines to emphasize more of the flowiness to the hair, since later on I'm going to color with minimal shading and will mostly keep it solid, so a lot of the volume and depth will be shown through the line work. Taking advantage of changing up the line weight or the thickness of the lines and including variations of hatching at certain sections of the drawing can add a variety of depth to the overall look. For characters or areas that you want to make stand out especially, you can give them a slightly thicker outline, which will help make them stand out more. It's, to be fair, a bit of a balance, figuring out what to outline really thickly and what you would keep as is. Contrast between the line weight can help bring the viewer's attention to the focal point, but at the same time, too much contrast happening everywhere can distract the eyes away from the very important areas and towards other parts of the drawing unintentionally. Okay, so this next upcoming part in the video was a bit of a challenge for me to do. I was starting to line art this medieval window in the back. I will admit, working on more rigid structures, or I guess architecturally or non-organic subjects, is a bit of a challenge for me. More often than not, I would try and avoid having drawings that would kind of involve a lot of the more rigid structures, or I kind of hide them a bit more in the background. If you look through my old drawings, you could kind of see, you could still see it even now, but I felt like without the windows in this specific drawing, it would have felt very incomplete. So you can imagine the amount of umming and ahhing going on in the background real time, just trying to figure out what design for the window to lock down on so that it still looks very magnificent and grand, but at the same time still be completed within a reasonable amount of time while avoiding driving me up the wall throughout the entire process. A simple method that really saved me in the long run of working or setting up the window to line cleanly was that I divided the window itself into a rectangle or a quadrant with equally divided sections. Having it laid out like that as a guideline of some sorts really helped me make sure that everything looked symmetrical and everything just was balanced visually. I'll be using and applying the concept of the quadrants on the windows and all of the details on it later again for when I ink it. I will go more into detail on that whenever we get around to that point, because it seems like at this point I decided to just jump back, essentially procrastinate from working on the windows and just go through the very tedious task of drawing in all of the scales. Yes, to be fair, this was one of the most therapeutic parts of inking this drawing. Drawing in the scales is an act that I find I can go a bit more mindless on it, since I already have the structure of the dragon set up, and because there's so many scales and it's more on the organic side, it can be a bit more, I find it can be a bit more forgiving if I make one more inconsistent with the other and it kind of looks off, because realistically not all scales are the same. Just in keeping with a consistent pattern making sure that nothing looks too outrageously like standoffish from the rest, it'll look okay. The way that I approach scales, I tend to approach it as layering one scale over another. If you kind of look at like koi fish or goldfish, you can see how all the scales behave amongst each other. So while I am taking inspiration mostly from the koi fish, I did make some slight modifications to a lot of the scales on the, what would you say, near the top of the dragon's head. You can see that instead of using like the rounded scales, I made them more pointed, very much resembling more like that of a bearded dragon, or at least like the silhouette of a bearded dragon's head. And if you've maybe noticed during this entire time of me explaining the scales, I decided somehow to add a whole bunch of hatch marks to each of the scales visible on the dragon. I just like to give myself more work. To be fair, it turned out really nice, so I'm very happy with it. So during the times that you just see me very silent on all of my like social media accounts, please know that it's because I decided to last minute give myself a bunch of extra work. And okay, now we're at the part that I originally wanted to give a more in-depth explanation in using the quadrants to help with inking the windows. However, I noticed as I was editing this that somehow I lost the footage for that part. I'm not so sure if it's because I forgot to record it in that one time, or whether I just never imported the video into the editing software and deleted it before I realized it. It's all really strange. But regardless, I am genuinely sorry for this oversight. I'll continue to give an explanation for it, but I had hoped that there would have been like some kind of visual so that you can like easily understand it. I'll probably throw a clip somewhere on the screen at this point just to like share or give you a bit more of a clearer visual of what I'm talking about. Basically, I used Procreate's guide tools. They have quite a variety of functions that you can use them for. The most familiar function that I think people are mostly aware of would be either the grid option or the perspective option that it offers. The grid one basically is, as it says, it lays it out and it helps you with keeping a straight line when you draw. The perspective feature lets you set up vanishing points on a horizon, which really helps out when you're drawing like buildings or structures in whichever perspective you choose. And then there's the isometric grid and the symmetrical grid. The isometric grid is really fascinating. It's very similar to the grid, but instead it's more, what's the word? It feels more three-dimensional. So I've seen a lot of artists use it to create those like isometric rooms that you see, or if you want to create like patterns or textiles. It's not a function that I've used often enough to really give an in-depth explanation. I'll have to find a time to experiment more with it in the future. And then there's the symmetrical guidelines. Those have been a lifesaver. Basically how it works is that you are given a guide to place where you want. That guide will be the center of your drawing or what you are going to draw. Once you start drawing on one side, the program will automatically mirror whatever you have drawn on the other side, basically on the y-axis of that guide. It's very useful for when you want to have everything lined up very precisely and symmetrically. This is really what saved my life and cut a lot of the time that it would have taken me otherwise to have drawn the entirety of the window. I was able to just draw how I wanted the design to look like on one side, and it was able to complete it within roughly half the time. And then at that point, I'd be able to just make any necessary adjustments to make it feel more three-dimensional and fit in the space. Again, I love this. So by this point, you've noticed that we have finally finished line arting everything and have now jumped onto the next arduous step, which is color blocking. For this stage in the process, what I've done differently compared to my other drawings, or what I would usually do, is that this time I planned a bit more thoroughly the colors for the entire drawing at the very beginning after roughing out the sketch. This was done to speed up the process in the later stages and would also help me remember what I wanted it to look like initially. Otherwise, I'd very easily forget. The time spent on one drawing is usually spread out over the span of a week, with many other art-related projects just kind of interspersed. So having this little reminder lets me dive in straight into the project again after working on something else of an entirely different style or a different mindset. This allows me to not need to rebuild my momentum, so to say, to get back into the right mindset for the project. With having the colors pre-planned, I can use that as a lower energy gateway to ease back into the project. It's sort of like a warm-up. Also, locking in on the colors early on gives me more flexibility to make any adjustments and to fine-tune things more easily further down the line. Also, when you start to color block everything in, this is where you can start seeing what will work together and what won't. For example, I realized as I was coloring that I forgot to draw the other faces of the window frame to give off the impression that you can see through the glass to the other side. So I had to jump in really quickly and fix that. Also, I think it seemed like I added even more smoke than before. I guess once you put in the colors, it felt like there wasn't enough still. It's like there's never enough smoke, so the more the merrier. During this stage, I'm also looking at how the colors kind of like behave with each other. For example, right now you see me like coloring in the embroidery. I'm checking to see if the embroidery looks balanced on the cape, whether it looks too busy or it looks uneven anywhere. But so far it looks pretty decent. You'll see me like zoom in and out quite a bit. I chronically do that to see the whole picture, just to help refresh my brain and check out that everything looks good and works well together. Sometimes I get the habit of focusing on the smallest parts, which might not necessarily require all the time and energy that I invest in it. It's really similar to what I said earlier. Putting too much line weight and detail everywhere can at times distract and hinder more than help the overall look and feel of the drawing. Now, if you've noticed, I've colored the section near the bottom below the smoke black. I wanted to frame the entire composition in some way, partially to focus on what's happening above in the top half, and partially to give off an otherworldly or fantastical feel. The smoke was perfect for being able to do just that. I was able to wrap and weave it throughout the entire drawing and amongst Chuya, Dazai, and the dragon. Basically, below the smoke, the rest of reality just gently fades away. I am still using the tinderbox brush for this. It's just scaled up to a much larger point, and I'm trying to color everything in one swipe of the brush to keep the grainy texture consistent and even throughout. Sections like the dragon's mane, you can tell since it's really wispy, I needed to use the magic wand tool to just grab everything without worrying that I'm gonna miss some parts or that it's gonna be colored unevenly. I'm also double checking that I haven't forgotten to color in all the little details like the belt. At this point I realized too that I forgot to draw a section of the dragon that's hidden behind the curtains. I was like, oops, okay, let's throw that in really quickly. But finally, we're at the part where we're starting to like do some light shading, like some light self shading to everything now that all of the colors are in place. We usually start with the skin tone by adding blush and a little bit of contour shading, then jumping over to doing the eyes and pupil. These are all colored simply. It's very much flat shading, if that makes sense. I am only shading with usually one color darker, maybe two, and trying to minimize any blending to keep the effect that I want. Just lots of airbrushing. If there's any gradation at all, it's a combination of using the airbrush and the, let's see, we remember, Bonobo chalk brush. A really cool thing that I don't often use for this specific purpose is that I use the magic wand tool to select specific strands of the dragon's hair to shade with the Bonobo chalk brush. The name gets me every time. It gives off a really cool layered look. I do a bit of shading on Chuya's tunic, but it's more so to soften the edges of the shading rather than to like really blend it in. Since there's enough line art and hatching placed throughout to help with the perception of depth, there isn't too much of a need to fully shade everything. It's just adding some contour to bits of the gloves and focusing on very specific areas to apply such shading to. I think the only section that I really did that soft blending was with areas that had darker colors, like the bluish green of Chuya and Desai's outfits and like the black horns of the dragon. I am using the same brush that I did from inking, the Tinderbox brush. It's very much my go-to for most of my drawings, unless I have like very specific projects in mind, but that's my general default brush. For how I color, I work from the bottom up based on how my layers are ordered. I tend to break things into what's the furthest away from you, the viewer, at the bottom, and what's closest to you at the top of the stack of layers. The simplest example would be the colors for the background would be at the bottom, and then the dragon, and finally everyone else at the top. Going into more specifics for each character, I would have the layer for their skin, usually near the bottom of the layer stack, followed by the layers for the eyes, and then separate layers for each article of clothing in the order of how you would usually put them on. Pants near the bottom, then any of the inside shirts, any of the outer shirts, and a jacket, and then finally hair would most always be placed at the top. Details like sequins or embroidery, patterns of any sort in jewelry, I would usually place them near the top too, since they'd be considered like, outside or near the surface of what the character is wearing. And here's another instance that I'm kind of bending the rules on using minimal shading and blending. I wanted to make the furs look fluffier and have a bit more volume than what's like shown, so I made the shading look much chunkier and with texture. And see here, I bent the rules again for the smoke. I used a combination of the Bonobo chalk brush and a different soft brush that's set on a separate layer set to multiply to give it that layered, wispy effect. There was a lot of back and forth involved, and I had to keep on jumping between the two layers to first add more shading on the multiply layer, and then zooming out to double check that everything looks good and that the shading isn't too strong or contrasting with the rest of the image. And if so, I'd go back in and erase some of the parts very gently with a soft brush until it looks better to me. I'd kept on repeating those steps until I found that perfect balance. And after working on the curtains for a bit, I felt like that area just felt a bit too sparse to my liking, so I added some more smoke. The convenience of using smoke as part of your drawing as the common motif for everything. It was very simple. I just added one in between everything else and then just repeated the steps as last time. For the smoke in the background, I also did the same thing as what I explained earlier. I just shaded everything a tiny smidgen darker so that it looks further back. Coloring for the golden embroidery is interesting, since usually when I color them, I want to make it feel as if they have erased texture. Like, if you run your hands over them, you'll feel the bumpiness of the pattern yourself. So, of course, that means I jumped straight in and shaded every bit of the pattern that existed and contoured a good chunk of the embroidery. It's a very straightforward process. It's very similar to when I am lining the scales. I only use one color for shading and one for highlighting to maintain the simplicity of the overall look, to not make it too busy since there's already a big pattern, and also to help me try not to hyperfixate on it too much. The dragon's eye was a bit of an experiment. I wanted to make it look glowing and really glassy and lifelike. I used quite a few layers with different effects on each one to test and experiment with to find a happy result. And so this marks the point that I'm shifting all of my attention now to the rest of the dragon. I will be shading all of the scales. Yes, I never moved on from them, but I promise this is the last time that you'll ever hear me mention them again. I am, once again, making hatch marks onto the dragon, but this time it's with using a red colored brush that's on low opacity rather than inking it entirely with black. Changing the opacity on the brush really helps gives the illusion of depth without really needing to blend so much, so long as you have the base layer with some form of gradation or shading already put in place. It's really similar to setting a layer up to multiply or to overlay, if that makes more sense. And okay, now it seems like I've decided to recolor some of the line art to make them more cohesive with all of the colors together. And now we finally decide to focus on the window. It's one of the things that I really procrastinated on until the very end. I was mostly waffling between what kind of color palette I'd like to use for the landscape. The windows itself was pretty straightforward to color once they were fully inked and I got the structure set up. For the landscape, I still kind of wanted to keep it similar to my original inspiration of The Last Unicorn in terms of just like feel and tone. So I ultimately settled on a cool color scheme moonrise kind of moment. I also wasn't too sure whether I wanted to keep the landscape simple with just like slight shading or gradation, or ultimately give it a more blended approach. But since I saw that it was kind of like a backdrop or a scenery, I figured having it more blended to kind of like resemble a watercolor or gouache painting would be okay in the end. The Bonobo chalk brush was used for the sky, whereas the tinderbox brush on lower opacity was used to paint the rest of the scenery. And so shortly we'll begin to reorganize all the layers to duplicate together into one image for the color correcting. I will be using both the curve tool, the color balance tool, and the gradient map tool to rebalance all the colors and to give the drawing an overall more antiquated look, similar to a painting that's slightly faded in time since it's centuries old. I also upped the red tone with the blue accents to make them pop out some more as well. And once it's all been locked down, we'll put in some final touches, like adding in highlights, recoloring in parts that have faded through the recoloring process, and adding in some extra details. Since we're nearing the end, I'd like to give a quick shout out to my supporters on Ko-fi. My supporters help me to happily continue pursuing my life as a freelance artist and illustrator, and without them, it wouldn't be the same. Special thanks to the one who requested for Dragon Prince Chuya for July's rewards. Your request has changed me as a person, and I hope others enjoyed this prompt as well. You can check out my Ko-fi or shop in the link below if you'd like to support my channel. And now we're finished. Here is the final version of the drawing. Thank you again everyone for watching this far. Please take care of yourselves, and until next time, bye bye!